Every time my neighbor saw my husband, she smiled. Not at me. At him. It was a small thing at first, the kind of thing I told myself I was imagining, but once I noticed it, I couldn't stop noticing it. The way she'd light up whenever Daniel walked outside to get the mail or wave at her from across the yard, her whole face softening into something warmer than the polite neighborliness she showed everyone else on the street, including me. We'd only just moved into the neighborhood a couple of months earlier, a quiet street lined with older houses and mature trees, the kind of place I'd dreamed about while working long shifts at the veterinary clinic, imagining a slower life outside of work. Julia lived 2 houses down, and she'd been the first to welcome us, showing up with a plate of banana bread the week we moved in, introducing herself with an easy warmth that made me like her immediately. She was in her early 40s, beautiful in a way that seemed effortless, the kind of woman who could show up at your door in old jeans and a t-shirt and still look like she'd stepped out of a magazine. I liked her. At least, I wanted to. But as the weeks passed, I started noticing things I couldn't quite explain away. She seemed to be outside every time Daniel left for a run, always ready with an easy comment, a question about his route, a compliment on his pace. She brought over baked goods more often than seemed necessary for casual neighbors, and always the kind Daniel loved best, cinnamon rolls, banana bread with walnuts, the specific things he mentioned once in passing conversation that I hadn't even fully registered until I saw her handing him a plate of exactly that a week later. Then there was the coffee. One morning I came downstairs to find her standing in our kitchen, having stopped by to drop off a jar of homemade jam, and she was already telling Daniel his usual order at the coffee shop down the street before he'd even said good morning to her: oat milk, 2 sugars, extra hot, rattled off like she'd memorized it, like it was something she thought about. I stood in the doorway watching them laugh together over something I hadn't caught the beginning of, feeling like a guest in my own kitchen. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that jealousy was an ugly, small thing, and I didn't want to become the kind of woman who saw threats in every friendly neighbor. Daniel and I had a good marriage, a genuinely happy one, 5 years in and still finding new things to love about each other, still choosing each other easily, without complication. But happiness, I was learning, doesn't make you immune to doubt. It just makes the doubt feel more like a betrayal of yourself when it shows up anyway. The moment that finally cracked something open in me happened on a Saturday afternoon. Daniel was out front fixing the latch on our gate, and Julia had wandered over under the pretense of borrowing a tool, and I watched from the kitchen window as she reached out and touched his forearm while she laughed at something he said, her hand lingering there a beat longer than any casual touch should. Daniel didn't seem to notice, didn't pull away, just kept talking, oblivious in the way men sometimes are to things women register instantly. But I noticed. I noticed everything. I didn't say anything to him that night, though I lay awake replaying the image of her hand on his arm, feeling something small and sharp lodge itself under my ribs. I told myself I was overreacting, that Daniel had given me no real reason to doubt him in 5 years of marriage, that he came home to me every night, told me he loved me like he meant it, had never once given me cause to question his loyalty. But knowing all of that logically didn't stop the quieter, less rational part of me from constructing a story anyway, filling in the gaps between banana bread and coffee orders and lingering touches with a narrative that made a terrible kind of sense. I started watching for her. I noticed how she always seemed to know when Daniel would be outside, how her eyes would find him first in any group setting, how her smile changed entirely when it was directed at him, softer, more private, like something she was trying and failing to keep to herself. I began to dread the sound of her knock at our door, because I no longer knew if I was opening it for a friendly neighbor or for someone slowly, carefully building something with my husband that I wasn't part of. I almost said something to Daniel a dozen times. I'd start the sentence in my head, rehearse it while I was at work between appointments, imagining how I would bring it up without sounding paranoid or insecure, without turning myself into the jealous wife I'd promised myself I would never become. But every time I opened my mouth, the words felt too small for the size of the fear behind them, and I'd swallow them back down instead, letting the suspicion sit and grow in the silence. Then one evening, a few weeks into this slow unraveling, there was a knock at our door while Daniel was at the gym. I opened it and found Julia standing there, alone, dressed more plainly than I usually saw her, none of her usual easy confidence in her posture. She asked if she could come in, and something in her voice made my stomach drop, because I was certain, in that instant, that I was finally about to hear the truth I'd been dreading for weeks. I let her in and we sat in the living room, and she was quiet for a moment before she said, "Can I ask you something, alone?" And I remember bracing myself so hard my jaw ached, waiting for a confession, for an apology, for some version of the words I'd been rehearsing my own reaction to for days. I thought about how I would respond, whether I would cry or go cold and silent, whether I would ask her to leave or demand every detail of what had been happening between her and my husband. Instead, she reached into her bag and pulled out an old photograph, its edges soft and worn from handling, and held it out to me with hands that were trembling slightly. I took it and looked down at a young man in the picture, maybe 20 years old, standing on some college quad with his arms slung around another young man's shoulders, both of them laughing at something outside the frame. And the young man on the left looked so much like Daniel that for a moment I thought it actually was him, some old photo I'd never seen before, until I looked closer and understood it wasn't. "That's my brother," Julia said, her voice catching. "His name was Mark. He and your husband were best friends in college." I sat there holding the photograph, waiting for the rest of it, feeling the shape of the story shift into something I hadn't anticipated at all. Julia told me that her brother and Daniel had been inseparable back then, the kind of friendship that defines a certain stretch of your life, roommates for 2 years, the kind of closeness that survives distance and time until something even bigger interrupts it entirely. Mark had died in a car accident 20 years ago, not long after graduation, in a crash that had shattered their whole family and, from what she understood, had devastated Daniel too, so completely that he'd never been able to talk about it afterward, not to new friends, not to girlfriends, not, apparently, even to me. I sat there stunned, trying to reconcile this story with the man I'd been married to for 5 years, a man I thought I knew completely, and realizing there was an entire chapter of grief in him I'd never once glimpsed. Julia explained that when she and her husband had bought the house down the street a few years back, she hadn't known Daniel lived nearby, hadn't recognized him at first, not until she saw him closely one afternoon and felt the ground shift beneath her, because for a moment, just a moment, it was like seeing her brother again, the same jaw, the same laugh, an uncanny echo of someone she'd spent 2 decades learning to live without. She told me that was why she smiled at him the way she did, why she found herself lingering near him, why she remembered small details like his coffee order almost without meaning to, because some part of her kept trying to hold on to whatever fragment of her brother she could find in this stranger who happened to resemble him. She said she knew it probably looked strange from the outside, knew she probably made me uncomfortable without ever intending to, and she'd finally worked up the courage to explain herself because she couldn't stand the thought of me misunderstanding something that had nothing to do with Daniel at all, and everything to do with a loss she'd never fully stopped carrying. I felt something enormous move through me sitting there, shame tangled together with relief, and underneath both of those, a kind of tenderness for this woman I'd spent weeks quietly resenting, who had actually just been grieving in the only way she knew how, using my husband's face as an accidental doorway back to someone she loved and lost far too young. I thought about every lingering smile I'd catalogued as evidence of betrayal, every touch I'd interpreted as intimacy, and understood now that I had been reading an entirely different language than the one actually being spoken. Daniel came home while we were still sitting there, and I watched his face change when he saw the photograph in my hands, watched 2 decades of buried grief surface all at once as he crossed the room and picked it up carefully, like it might dissolve if he held it too roughly. He hadn't seen a photo of Mark in years, he told us later, his voice rougher than I'd ever heard it. He'd never talked about him because the loss had happened right as he was becoming the person he'd go on to be, and somehow it had felt easier to leave that grief folded up quietly in the past than to keep carrying it into every new relationship, including ours. Julia asked for only one thing that evening. "Would you tell me about the man my brother became friends with?" she said, looking at Daniel with an expression that held both hope and hesitation, like she wasn't sure she had the right to ask. And Daniel said yes, of course, and something in the room loosened, the tension of the last few weeks dissolving into something gentler. We spent the rest of that evening together, the 3 of us, going through old photographs Julia had brought and stories Daniel had never told me before, laughing at memories of a young man none of us could bring back but all of us, in our own ways, got to know a little better that night. I watched my husband talk about his college years with an openness I hadn't seen from him before, watched Julia's face soften with something that looked like healing rather than just grief, and I felt my own jealousy dissolve into something closer to gratitude, for the accident of proximity that had brought these 2 people back into contact with a piece of the person they'd both loved and lost. Later that night, after Julia had gone home, Daniel and I sat together on the porch, and I told him honestly what I'd been thinking these past weeks, how easily I'd built a story out of banana bread and coffee orders and a hand lingering too long on his arm. He wasn't angry. He just held my hand and told me he understood that grief and love can look confusingly similar from the outside if you don't know what you're looking at. I think about that a lot now, how close I came to letting suspicion poison something that was never anything but sorrow wearing an unfamiliar face. Sometimes we mistake someone's grief for someone's guilt, and it's only when we finally ask the right question, or let someone else ask it for us, that the whole shape of the truth becomes visible. Have you ever judged a situation before knowing the whole story?